October 1943. 6 miles above the unforgiving grey waters of the North Sea, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a vibrating metal tube. Inside the B-17 flying fortress, nicknamed Lady Luck, the air was a razor-thin mixture of sweat, cordite, and the icy breath of the stratosphere, so cold that exposed skin would flash freeze in seconds. For Sergeant Joe Kowalski, a 20-year-old waste gunner from the flat farmlands of Ohio, this frozen hell was his office, and his desk was a .50 caliber Browning machine gun. His world wasn't measured in miles, but in seconds. The seconds it took for a black speck on the horizon to resolve into the angel of death silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, and one was coming now, a predator climbing out of the sun, its wings winking as its cannons flashed. Every instinct honed over millions of years of evolution screamed at Joe, a primal, undeniable command. Point at the thing that is trying to kill you and shoot. It was the most natural, most logical impulse in the world. And it was a lie. The German fighter wasn't flying in a straight line relative to the bomber. It was executing a high-speed deflection pass, a slashing attack from the side, intending to rip through the bomber's thin aluminum skin and disappear before the gunners could react. The pilot was an ace, a veteran of 100 dogfights, and he knew the American gunners would do the predictable thing. He was counting on it. He was counting on Joe to aim directly at him. Joe's knuckles were white inside his heated gloves. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could see the yellow spinner on the Messerschmitt's nose, a splash of arrogant color against the gray sky. His mind, his body, his very soul, urged him to swing the heavy barrel of the Browning, place the glowing reticle of his sight directly on that spinning yellow cone, and squeeze the butterfly triggers until the gun ran dry. But he didn't. Instead, he did something that looked like pure insanity. He fought against his own senses, a wave of nausea and panic rising in his throat. He forced himself to remember the endless drills under the blistering Nevada sun, the voice of a grizzled Texas sergeant echoing in his memory. Don't trust your eyes, trust the math. He swung the gun, not at the approaching fighter, but to a patch of completely empty sky far behind it. To an outside observer, it would have seemed as if Joe had lost his nerve, firing blindly in a desperate, futile prayer. He was aiming where the German plane had been seconds ago, a ghost position that no longer existed. He was aiming at nothing. The distance was closing at over 500 miles per hour. The German pilot, seeing the stream of American tracers lacing the air harmlessly behind his tail, might have felt a flicker of contemptuous confidence. Another green farm boy, another wasted burst of ammunition. He adjusted his course slightly, lining up the bomber's wing route for a killing blow. And in that precise, calculated instant, two realities converged. The reality of the German pilot, flying his aircraft with lethal precision, and the hidden reality of physics that Joe had been trained to see. The .50 caliber rounds, fired from Joe's gun, did not simply fly straight out of the barrel. They were born into a hurricane, inheriting the forward momentum of the B-17, which was thundering through the sky at 200 miles per hour. The bullets weren't just moving away from the gun. They were also moving forward with the bomber, creating a curving, invisible stream of death. The German ace flew his Messerschmitt directly into that stream. There was no sound Joe could hear over the roar of his own engines and the deafening chatter of his gun. But the visual was sickeningly clear. His stream of tracers, which had appeared to be flying far behind the target, suddenly connected with it. It wasn't a single hit. It was a brutal, sustained impact, as if the fighter had slammed into a solid wall of steel and lead. One moment, it was a sleek killing machine. The next, its wings simply disintegrated, shredding into 1,000 pieces. The fuselage twisted violently, a canopy was ripped away, and the Bf 109 tumbled out of the sky, trailing a thick smear of black smoke before vanishing into the clouds below. It was over in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Silence descended in Joe's small section of the sky. The other gunners on the intercom were shouting, a mix of relief and disbelief. But Joe just leaned his forehead against the cold metal of his gun, his own breathing ragged. He hadn't performed a miracle. He had simply obeyed a law of physics that was more powerful than his own fear. He had done the impossible by doing what felt completely, utterly wrong. This was no lucky shot. It was the result of a secret, a hard-won doctrine born from catastrophic failure and revolutionary thinking. It was a technique known as position firing, a counterintuitive principle that would be drilled into over 200,000 young Americans like Joe. It was a system that forced men to unlearn a lifetime of instinct and place their faith in the cold, hard logic of mathematics to survive. Before this revolution in training, American bombers were being slaughtered in the skies over Europe, their gunners firing millions of rounds for every enemy plane hit. The entire strategic bombing campaign, a cornerstone of the Allied path to victory, was on the brink of collapse. The question was not just how this single technique worked. The real question was, what disaster, what series of brutal lessons had become so terrible that the US Army Air Forces were forced to rewrite the very rules of aerial combat? How did they take ordinary boys from farms and factories and reprogram their minds to make this impossible shot not just possible, but repeatable? To find that answer, we must go back to a time, not long before Joe's harrowing fight, when America had brave men and powerful planes, but possessed a fatal flaw. It had absolutely no idea how to teach them to fight in the sky. The journey to that shot in the sky above the North Sea didn't begin in a cockpit, but in the desolate emptiness of the American desert, with an admission that everything they thought they knew was wrong. That impossible shot, the one that saved Joe Kowalski and the crew of the Lady Luck, was not an invention of the moment. It was a desperate remedy, a radical cure for a disease that was killing the United States Army Air Forces before it could even truly fight. To understand the cure, we must first look unflinchingly at the sickness. We must go back to 1941, to a nation standing on the precipice of global conflict, armed with industrial might and boundless optimism, yet harboring a catastrophic, almost unbelievable, blind spot. As America awakened to the reality of a world at war, it began a mobilization effort unparalleled in human history. Factories that once built refrigerators and family cars were retooled to churn out tanks, ships, and aircraft at a staggering rate. The iconic B-17 Flying Fortress, a marvel of engineering, was rolling off assembly lines, destined to become the primary instrument of American air power over Europe. It was a magnificent weapon, bristling with up to 13 .50 caliber machine guns. It was designed to be a self-defending battleship of the sky, but a weapon is only as effective as the hand that wields it. And in 1941, America had a profound and deadly problem. It had no idea how to train the hands for this new kind of war. The United States Army Air Forces, the most technologically advanced military air arm in the world, had precisely zero standardized programs, zero specialized facilities, and zero official doctrines for training the aerial gunners who were supposed to defend its bombers. The assumption, a tragically naive one, was that any good soldier who could shoot a rifle on the ground could be placed behind a machine gun in the sky and perform effectively. They could not have been more wrong. The warning signs were already there, written in the blood of their British allies. The Royal Air Force, RAF, had learned the brutal truth in the fiery skies of 1940 and 1941. Their bombers, the Wellingtons, the Hamptons, the Sterlings, had ventured into German-occupied territory, only to be met by a wall of German steel wielded by the seasoned pilots of the Luftwaffe. The British gunners were brave, defiant, and almost entirely ineffective. They did what instinct told them to do. They aimed squarely at the attacking fighters, fired furious bursts, and watched in horror as their bullets flew harmlessly behind their targets, seemingly curving away as if by some dark magic. German pilots grew confident, contemptuous even, as they sliced through bomber formations, turning the RAF's flying machines into flying coffins. The sky over Europe was not a battlefield, it was a slaughterhouse. This raised a terrifying question that echoed through the halls of Allied command. Why were some of the deadliest marksmen on the ground, men who could hit a moving target from hundreds of yards away, suddenly rendered so helpless in the air? The answer was not a failure of courage, but a failure of perception. The environment inside a B-17 during combat was a chaotic symphony of roaring engines, vibrating metal, and the terrifyingly personal sight of cannon shells ripping through the fuselage next to you. It was a three-dimensional arena moving at hundreds of miles per hour, a fluid, swirling battle space unlike anything in human history. And the men sent into this arena were not seasoned theorists of ballistics. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from New York City. They were products of the real, tangible world, a world governed by a lifetime of learned physics and common sense. If you want to throw a ball to a running friend, you lead them. You throw it to where they will be. Every hunter, every quarterback, every child playing in a schoolyard understood this. This was the instinct they brought with them into the sky, but in the unique geometry of an aerial deflection shot, where their own platform was moving at incredible speed, this fundamental instinct was a lie. The primal urge to lead the target was causing them to miss every single time. Their own common sense had become a death sentence. This was not a minor tactical issue, it was a strategic crisis of the highest order. The entire Allied plan for winning the war in Europe hinged on the concept of high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. The goal was to cripple Germany's industrial heart, to destroy its factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs, paralyzing its ability to wage war. But this strategy could only work if the bombers could reach their targets, deliver their payloads, and return home to fly again. Without effective defensive gunners, the magnificent B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were little more than slow, predictable targets for the swift and deadly German fighters. The math was grim. Early combat reports were filtering back, painting a picture of devastating losses. For every bomber lost, 10 crewmen were lost with it. The air forces were facing an unsustainable rate of attrition that threatened to bleed them dry before the main offensive could even begin. Morale was plummeting, both in the air and on the ground. The promise of the flying fortress, the great American weapon that was supposed to bring the war to Hitler's doorstep, was turning into a tragic failure. The entire strategic bombing campaign was teetering on the brink of disaster. America needed an answer, and it needed one fast. It became painfully clear that bravery was not enough. More guns were not enough. The problem was more fundamental. It was a problem of the human mind, of breaking an instinct millions of years in the making. They had to find a way to teach men to see the invisible, to trust abstract calculations over the evidence of their own eyes, all while facing imminent, violent death. The answer wouldn't be found in building better guns or faster planes. It would be found in the most unlikely of places, the barren, sun-scorched desert of Nevada, where a man with a vision was about to build a school designed to teach thousands of young men how to forget everything they thought they knew about survival. The crisis demanded a new kind of thinking, a leader who could see beyond the immediate chaos of battle and diagnose the root of the failure. That leader was Colonel Martinez Stenith. He wasn't a desk-bound officer, he was a pragmatist, a man who understood that the most complex problems often required the simplest, most brutal assessments. And his assessment was this: America's gunners weren't failing because they lacked courage. They were failing because they had been given a powerful tool without an instruction manual. The problem wasn't the men, it was the entire absence of a system. In January of 1941, while politicians in Washington, D.C. debated the finer points of diplomacy, Colonel Stenith was surveying a vast, unforgiving expanse of scrubland under the crystalline blue sky of southern Nevada. To most, this land was worthless, a sun-blasted wasteland of rock, sand, and creosote bushes, fit only for scorpions and rattlesnakes. But to Stenith, this emptiness was the perfect canvas. It was a blank slate, a place free from the old, failed doctrines of the past, where a new kind of school and a new kind of soldier could be born from scratch. His vision was audacious, a perfect embodiment of the American can-do spirit that was mobilizing the nation. He wasn't there to build a simple firing range. He was there to create a factory, an industrial-scale institution dedicated to the mass production of the world's most effective aerial gunners. He secured a lease from the city of Las Vegas for over 60,000 acres of this desolate land. The price? A symbolic $1 per year. It was a bargain that signaled the government's desperate urgency. They were betting everything on Stenith's belief that this problem could be solved not with more steel, but with knowledge. What followed was a minor miracle of logistics and sheer determination. In a breathtakingly short amount of time, the desert was transformed. Bulldozers carved roads out of the dust. Barracks, classrooms, and mess halls rose from the desert floor. Firing ranges, equipped with complex moving targets and towering backstops, were constructed under the relentless sun. The Las Vegas Army Airfield, later to become Nellis Air Force Base, sprang into existence, a testament to the idea that American ingenuity could conquer any environment. It was more than a base. It was a laboratory. Its sole purpose was to conduct a radical experiment, the systematic deconstruction and rebuilding of human instinct. The first wave of students arrived before the paint on the new buildings was even dry. They were a cross-section of a nation girding for war. They were boys like Joe Kowalski, fresh from the quiet routines of civilian life. They had left behind plows, lathes, and ledger books, and were now expected to master a deadly craft in a terrifyingly alien environment. They arrived with the common-sense notions of a lifetime spent on the ground, confident in their ability to aim and shoot. They were about to discover that everything they thought they knew was not just wrong, but actively trying to kill them. The philosophy of Stenith's school was revolutionary because it was deeply humble. It began with the admission of ignorance. The instructors, handpicked for their open-mindedness and ability to teach, didn't pretend to have all the answers from day one. Instead, they fostered an environment of intense, practical research. The first lessons were designed not to build skill, but to shatter false confidence. New recruits were put on the back of flatbed trucks, armed with shotguns, and ordered to shoot at clay pigeons, launched at varying angles as the truck bounced along a rough desert road. It was a brilliant, simple, and deeply frustrating exercise. Even the most experienced hunters and marksmen missed, again and again. The exercise immediately and viscerally taught them the core problem. Calculating the combined motion of a moving shooter and a moving target was a complex physics problem, far beyond the reach of simple intuition. It was the first step in breaking down their reliance on what felt right. It forced them to ask the most important question. If instinct was the enemy, what was the alternative? This desert schoolhouse became a symbol of a uniquely American approach to warfare. It wasn't about relying on a warrior ethos or ancient traditions of combat. It was about identifying a problem, applying scientific principles, engineering a system, and then scaling that system to produce consistent, predictable, and superior results. It was the factory mindset applied to the art of war. They were building a human weapons system, and just like any other piece of advanced machinery, it required a precise and rigorously tested operating manual. But how do you write a manual for the human mind? How do you distill the complex laws of physics into a simple set of actions that a terrified 20-year-old could execute flawlessly while being shot at? They had the institution. They had the students, eager and willing. They had shattered the old, failed instincts. Now, they needed the new gospel. They needed the scientific truth, the core principle that would become the foundation of all future training. And that truth would be delivered not by a high-ranking general or a scientist in a lab coat, but by a plain-spoken sergeant from Texas who understood that to survive at 20,000 feet, you first had to understand the simple physics of a child's playground swing. The secret was there, waiting to be unlocked. The men were humbled. The desert sun had baked the arrogance out of them, and the simple exercise with the shotguns had left them confused and frustrated. They were now sitting in a stiflingly hot, hastily constructed classroom, the air thick with the smell of sweat and plywood. They were ready to listen, but they were also deeply skeptical. They were soldiers, not scholars. They needed an answer that made sense, not in a textbook, but in a life or death firefight. The man who would give them that answer was not a general, nor a physicist from some prestigious university. He was Sergeant Robert Hayes, a man whose slow Texas drawl disguised a mind as sharp as a Bowie knife. Hayes didn't look like a revolutionary thinker. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face that suggested he was more comfortable under an open sky than a roof. He walked to the front of the classroom, picked up a piece of chalk, and faced the sea of young, questioning faces. He knew he wasn't just teaching a class. He was trying to save their lives by convincing them to declare war on their own common sense. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and steady, "out there on that truck, you learned a valuable lesson. You learned that what feels right can be dead wrong. Now I'm going to tell you why. Forget everything you think you know about shooting. We're going to talk about something simpler. We're going to talk about a baseball." A low murmur went through the room. Hayes let it die down. "Imagine you're riding in a car, going a steady 60 miles an hour, down a straight road. In your hand, you're holding a baseball. If you just open your hand and drop that ball out the window, where does it go?" A few hands went up. One recruit volunteered. "It falls straight down, Sarge." Hayes shook his head slowly. "Feels like it should, doesn't it? But it don't. The second you let go of that ball, it's already moving forward at 60 miles an hour, same as the car. It doesn't just drop. It flies forward, arcing through the air, and lands in a ditch, way up the road. It inherited the speed of the car. We call that inherited velocity. Remember that phrase." He let the concept sink in. It was a simple, observable fact, but one most people never stopped to consider. "Now," Hayes continued, raising the stakes, "let's say instead of just dropping it, you throw that ball sideways, as hard as you can, at a fence post on the side of the road. Your arm gives it, say, 60 miles an hour of sideways speed, but it still has that 60 miles an hour of forward speed it inherited from the car. So, that ball ain't flying straight at the post. It's flying in a long forward curve. To hit that fence post, where would you have to aim?" The room was silent. The gears were turning. "You'd have to aim behind it," a young man from Brooklyn said, his voice hesitant. "You'd have to throw the ball before you got to the post, so it can curve forward and hit it." "Exactly," Hayes said, pointing his chalk at the recruit. "You have to aim at where the post was, not where it is. Now, let's stop playing games." He turned to the blackboard and drew a crude sketch of a B-17. "This bomber is your car, gentlemen. Only it's moving at 200 miles an hour. And your 50 cal bullet, that's your baseball." The analogy hit the room with the force of a physical blow. You could see the understanding dawning in their eyes. Every round you fire from that gun is already a part of the airplane. It's born into the sky, already moving forward at 200 miles an hour. The gunpowder gives it its sideways velocity, sure, but you can't erase that massive forward push. Your bullets are always curving forward. He then drew a German fighter, attacking from a 90-degree angle, the classic beam attack that had proven so deadly. The Hun is coming at you from the side. Your eyes, your brain, every fiber of your being is screaming at you to lead him, to shoot at the empty sky in front of him, 'cause that's where he's gonna be. It's the most natural thing in the world." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "And it's a guaranteed miss. Every single time. Why? Because your forward-moving bullet will get to that empty patch of sky long before he does. You will consistently shoot in front of him. To the German pilot, it looks like you can't shoot straight, but the truth is, you're shooting too well, based on the wrong information." Then came the secret, the revolutionary, mind-bending truth that would become their mantra. "To hit that fighter," Hayes said, his voice dropping to an intense, almost conspiratorial whisper, "you have to do the one thing that feels impossibly wrong. You have to aim behind him. You have to point your gun where he was a second ago. You're not trying to shoot a moving target. You are using the forward speed of your own bomber to lay a curving carpet of bullets into a patch of sky that he is about to fly into. You are aiming at his past to connect with his future. You are creating a collision in space and time. It was a staggering concept, a truth so alien to their experience that it felt like a form of magic. It was the answer they had been searching for, but it was also a terrifying burden. It meant that in the split-second chaos of combat, with enemy cannons flashing and the plane bucking around them, they would have to consciously, deliberately betray their own senses. They would have to place their faith not in their eyes, but in a law of physics explained to them by a sergeant in a dusty classroom. Hayes knew what they were thinking. He saw the doubt wrestling with the newfound understanding on their faces. Knowing this in here, he said, tapping his temple, is easy. But knowing it in your bones, in your muscles, when you're scared and freezing, and that Messerschmitt is growing in your sights, that's a different animal altogether. How do we do that, Sarge? Someone asked from the back. That, Sergeant Hayes said, a grim smile touching his lips, is what the next 6 weeks are for. We're going to break you down, and we're going to build you back up. We are going to conduct the most grueling, repetitive, and psychologically demanding training you have ever imagined. We are going to run drills until this unnatural law becomes your new nature. We are going to overwrite millions of years of evolution, because out here, evolution gets you killed. Physics brings you home. The theory Sergeant Hayes laid out was elegant, logical, and terrifying. In the sterile quiet of a classroom, it made perfect sense. But in the heart of a swirling dogfight, logic is the first casualty. The human brain under mortal threat doesn't default to reason. It defaults to its oldest, deepest programming. To survive, these men needed more than an intellectual understanding of physics. They needed a new instinct, one so deeply ingrained that it would override the primal scream of fear and self-preservation. They needed to make the unnatural feel natural. And that was the brutal, singular purpose of the 6-week crucible that followed. This was not education. It was deconstruction and reconstruction. The program was an assembly line in reverse, designed to take apart a man's natural reactions and rebuild them according to a new, life-saving blueprint. Each week, each day, was a layer in this process, scientifically designed to overwrite the faulty code of common sense. The process began, as it had on their first day, on the back of bouncing trucks. But this was no longer a simple demonstration of their failure. It was now a relentless drill. For hours under the punishing Nevada sun, they fired shotguns at clay pigeons, launched from every conceivable angle. Instructors didn't just shout corrections. They drilled a new language into the recruits' minds. Follow through. Swing from the hips. See the space, not the target. They were teaching the body to lead, lag, and deflect without conscious thought. They were building the foundational muscle memory, bypassing the intellect and speaking directly to the nervous system. The goal was to make the act of aiming off target feel as intuitive as pointing a finger. From the grit of the desert floor, they moved into the cool darkness of a technological marvel, the Waller Gunnery Trainer. For 1943, this was science fiction come to life. Recruits would stand in a vast, dark dome, surrounded by a 180-degree screen. 5 synchronized film projectors would roar to life, throwing a stunningly realistic image of an aerial battle onto the curved walls. The trainee, manning a realistic machine gun mount, would be completely immersed. He could hear the drone of his bomber's engines from a sophisticated sound system as projected Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs screamed in to attack. The Waller Trainer was a genius invention because it was a laboratory for the mind. It allowed recruits to practice the abstract principles of position firing in a perfectly safe, endlessly repeatable environment. The guns they held were not real, but they were linked to a recording device. An instructor, watching from a booth, could see exactly where the recruit was aiming. Was he leading the target like a fool, or was he correctly placing his sights on that empty patch of sky behind it? Here, thousands of mental repetitions could be performed, forging the new neural pathways. It was in the cool, controlled darkness of the Waller Dome that the Texas sergeant's physics lesson began its migration from the conscious mind into the subconscious reflex. But a simulation, no matter how advanced, lacks the violent reality of live fire. The next phase was a deafening transition back to the real world. Trainees were taken up in B-17 seconds, the same models they would fly in combat. Their targets were long fabric banners, or sleeves, towed by other faster aircraft. For the first time, they felt the thunderous kick of the .50 caliber Browning M2 against their shoulder, a force so powerful it vibrated through their entire skeleton. They heard its deafening roar, smelled the acrid cordite, and watched their own streams of tracers, glowing red lines, streak across the vast blue canvas of the sky. This was the moment of truth. Could they ignore the roaring engine of the tow plane and remember to aim at the empty space where the sleeve would be? Many failed at first, their tracers whipping uselessly in front of the target. But with each pass, the lessons began to solidify. The theory was finally meeting reality. During this intense period of trial and error, the instructors, ever the pragmatists, began to notice a bizarre and fascinating pattern, a twist that defied all expectations. The recruits who consistently learned the fastest, the ones who mastered the counterintuitive art of position firing with the most ease, were often the ones who had the least prior experience with firearms. The city boys, the clerks, the students who had never hunted a day in their lives, frequently outperformed the seasoned farm boys and expert marksmen. Why? The reason was as profound as it was simple. The expert marksmen had to unlearn a lifetime of correct habits. Their instincts, honed on the ground, were a constant source of interference. They were fighting not just the enemy, but their own expertise. The city boys, however, were a blank slate. They had no bad habits to break, no ingrained instincts, screaming that this new method was wrong. Their minds were open, and they simply learned the correct way from the very beginning. It was a powerful, humbling lesson. Sometimes, the greatest obstacle to learning something new is not ignorance, but the illusion of old knowledge. The final exam was the culmination of all these stages. A program so innovative and bizarre, it was nicknamed Operation Pinball. AB-17, serving as a flying classroom, would fly a predetermined route over the desert. On the ground, instructors armed with specially modified shotguns were positioned in towers, on jeeps, and in camouflaged positions. These shotguns fired frangible pellets designed to shatter harmlessly against the bomber's aluminum skin. When an instructor on the ground was about to attack, a light would flash on their position, visible to the crew. The gunners inside had to spot the light, identify the threat, and swing their guns to engage. Instead of live rounds, their guns were fitted with camera guns that recorded precisely where they were aiming the moment they pulled the trigger. After the flight, the film would be developed and analyzed. Had they aimed correctly behind the moving pinball light on the ground? Had they accounted for their own speed and altitude? It was the ultimate test of awareness, teamwork, and, above all, faith in their new, forged instinct. When a young man stepped off that B-17 after passing Operation Pinball, he was a different person from the one who had arrived 6 weeks prior. The hesitant farm boy, or the nervous clerk, was gone. In his place stood a specialist, a technician of three-dimensional combat. His senses had been recalibrated. He no longer saw a target. He saw a complex physics problem and its deadly, elegant solution. The school had succeeded. It had systematically and successfully rewritten a fundamental piece of human software. But this perfectly engineered instinct, born in the controlled environment of the Nevada desert, was about to face its ultimate test. How would it fare against the unpredictable, unadulterated chaos of total war in the blood-red skies over a German city named Schweinfurt? The Nevada desert had forged a new kind of weapon, an American gunner with instincts re-engineered for the strange physics of the upper atmosphere. In the controlled environment of the training grounds, this weapon had been perfected and proven. But a weapon is not truly tested until it is used in the full, unscripted fury of war. That test would come on the 17th of August, 1943. a day that would be burned into the memory of the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday. The target was a small German city named Schweinfurt. Schweinfurt was, arguably, one of the most critical, strategic targets in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. It was home to a complex of factories that produced nearly half of all the ball bearings for the German war machine. Without a steady supply of these small, precision-engineered steel balls, the wheels of the Third Reich would literally grind to a halt. Tanks couldn't roll, airplane engines couldn't turn, and U-boat propellers couldn't spin. A successful strike against Schweinfurt could, in theory, shorten the war by months, even years. The stakes were immeasurably high, and the German High Command knew it. They had turned the airspace around the city into one of the most heavily defended sectors on the planet. This was the crucible into which the graduates of the desert classroom would be thrown. Among them was Sergeant Joe Kowalski, now a veteran of several missions. The initial terror of combat had subsided into a hardened, watchful tension. He had faith in his training. He had seen it work, dropping fighters in sudden, satisfying bursts of smoke and flame. But this mission felt different. The pre-flight briefing was grim. The target was deep. The German resistance would be fanatical, and their fighter escort could only accompany them part of the way. For a long, terrifying stretch, they would be on their own. As Lady Luck lifted off the runway in England, part of a vast armada of 376 bombers heading for Schweinfurt and a secondary target in Regensburg, Joe felt a cold knot in his stomach. The training was over. This was the final exam. For the first hour, the sky was deceptively peaceful, a majestic panorama of Allied air power. But as their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts reached the limit of their range, peeled away, and headed for home, a profound and unnerving silence fell over the radio. The bombers were alone, deep in enemy territory. And then they came. It wasn't a single attacker, or even a pair. It was a swarm. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the bomber stream. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even twin-engine night fighters, armed with heavy cannons and experimental air-to-air rockets. They came from every direction, at every altitude. They attacked from the front in terrifying head-on passes, from the rear, and from the sides in the classic beam attacks they had drilled for. But there was nothing classic about this. The sky was a three-dimensional maelstrom of streaking tracers, exploding flak, and falling, burning aircraft. This was the chaos that no simulation could ever replicate. Joe's world shrank to the view through his gun sight. His heart hammered, and the old, primal instinct roared back to life with a vengeance. Every nerve ending screamed at him to spray his bullets at the weaving, diving shapes, to aim at the flashes of their cannons. It was a physical effort to resist, a battle fought not just against the Luftwaffe, but against himself. Trust the math. Trust the math. The Texas sergeant's voice was a faint whisper against a hurricane of fear. A Focke-Wulf 190, its radial engine, a snarling black circle, banked sharply and began a firing run on the bomber next to them. Joe saw his chance. The German pilot was a master, not flying in a straight line, but skidding his aircraft to throw off the gunner's aim. Joe forced himself to ignore the fighter itself. He saw the space, the patch of empty blue where the fighter was going to be. He swung his big, .50 caliber gun, placing his sight on a ghost, on nothing, and squeezed the triggers. The gun bucked, the stream of tracers reaching out into the void. For a sickening half-second, it looked like a clean miss. The German pilot, likely seeing the fire go behind him, probably felt he was safe. But then, in a perfect, horrible confluence of physics and fate, his plane slammed into the invisible wall of lead. The FOF 190's canopy shattered, and the engine erupted in a greasy black cloud. The plane never exploded. It simply died, tumbling out of formation like a discarded toy. There was no time for relief, no time for celebration. Two more fighters were already coming in from below. Around him, the sky was filled with a terrible mixture of success and tragedy. The new training was working. The American gunners were scything down German fighters at an astonishing rate. Men who had been farm boys 6 months ago were now winning duels against the most seasoned aces of the Luftwaffe. They were firing with a disciplined, deadly accuracy that the Germans had never encountered before and for which they had no answer. But the sheer number of attackers was overwhelming. The air was thick with steel. Joe saw a B-17 to his left take a direct hit in the wing root. The entire wing sheared off, and the bomber, with 10 men inside, began its final, horrifying spin toward the earth. A parachute blossomed, then another, but not 10. Never 10. Every successful kill Joe made was punctuated by the loss of friends, of another bomber full of men just like him. When the last of the bombers finally turned for home, leaving Schweinfurt a smoking ruin, the battle had been a brutal, two-sided slaughter. The final tally was staggering. It is believed that the American gunners, in one of the greatest defensive air battles ever fought, shot down somewhere between 25 and 50 German fighters, with some estimates running far higher, a catastrophic loss for the Luftwaffe. The graduates of the Desert School had passed their test with bloody honors. Position firing was no longer a theory. It was a combat-proven doctrine of incredible lethality. But the cost was a nightmare. 60 flying fortresses, each with a crew of 10, failed to return. 600 men were killed, captured, or missing in action. As the survivors of the raid, their planes riddled with thousands of bullet and shrapnel holes, limped back to their bases in England, they flew through the empty spaces in the sky where their sister ships had been. The Schweinfurt mission was a tactical catastrophe, a loss so severe it forced the Allies to suspend deep penetration raids for months. Yet, in the midst of this disaster was a hard, undeniable truth. The system had worked. The man behind the gun had been perfected. The problem was that even perfection had its limits against a wall of unrelenting force. The human mind and body could only endure so much. A new question now hung heavy in the air with the smell of aviation fuel and cordite. Could the machine now be taught to help the man? Could technology offer the next leap forward, not just in lethality, but in survival? The skies over Schweinfurt had delivered a brutal, contradictory verdict. On one hand, the principle of position firing, drilled into thousands of young men in the Nevada desert, was an unqualified success. It had turned American gunners into the most lethal aerial defenders in the world. On the other hand, the sheer mental and physical toll of applying those principles under the unimaginable stress of mass combat was pushing the limits of human endurance. The mind could calculate, the body could react, but both could be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of chaos. The human component of the system had been optimized. Now, it was time for the machine to evolve. The answer arrived not as a new gun or a faster airplane, but as a small, deceptively simple-looking device that would be mounted in the gunners' stations. To the men who used it for the first time, it felt like a form of witchcraft. It was the K-14 gyro gun sight, a piece of technology so advanced it was essentially an analog computer, a mechanical brain designed to perform the miracle of position firing automatically. This revolutionary device had its origins in Great Britain, developed by engineers who had faced the same deadly paradox as their American allies. American industry, with its genius for mass production and refinement, took the core concept, perfected it, and began installing it in its bombers. The K-14 was not just an improvement, it was a quantum leap. It promised to relieve the gunner of the most difficult task he faced, the complex, split-second mental calculation of where to aim. Its operation was a marvel of elegant simplicity, masking incredible internal complexity. The old sight was a simple ring and bead, a static aiming point. The K-14 was a dynamic, living thing. When a gunner looked through it, he saw a glowing orange circle of 6 diamond-shaped dots, called a reticle, projected onto a glass plate. His new job was deceptively easy. Using a small control stick, he simply had to adjust the size of that glowing circle until it perfectly framed the wingspan of the attacking enemy fighter. Then, he just had to keep the fighter centered within that circle. That was it. He no longer had to think about aiming behind the target. His only task was to track, inside the site's metal housing, a tiny gyroscope, spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, was performing the real magic. This gyroscope acted as a stable reference point in space. As the gunner smoothly tracked the enemy plane, the gyroscope sensed the rate of that movement, how fast he was traversing his guns to keep the target framed. By measuring that rate, the K-14's intricate system of gears and linkages was continuously and instantly solving the complex trigonometric equations that Sergeant Hayes had explained on the chalkboard. It calculated the target's speed, its range, the B-17's own forward velocity, and the bullet's trajectory. Then, it automatically fed this information to the gun turret's hydraulic motors, physically moving the 50 caliber machine guns to point not where the gunner was looking, but to the precise, mathematically correct collision point in the sky. The gunner tracked the plane. The guns aimed at a ghost. The K-14 was the physical embodiment of the desert classroom's core lesson. This was a profound shift in the relationship between man and machine. The K-14 did not replace the gunner. A clumsy operator who couldn't smoothly track a target would still be ineffective. In fact, a gunner who didn't fundamentally understand the principles of position firing would never truly trust the device, fighting it instead of working with it. The graduates of the Nevada schools, however, were the perfect partners for this new technology. They had already been reprogrammed to understand the physics of the battle. The sight didn't give them a skill they lacked. It liberated the skill they already possessed. It took the immense cognitive burden of calculation off their shoulders. In the heat of battle, a gunner no longer had to divide his attention between tracking the enemy, remembering the specific deflection angles for a beam attack versus a head-on pass, and fighting his own instincts. The K-14 freed his mind to focus on the one thing a human is uniquely good at: smooth, predictive tracking, and situational awareness. It was the ultimate synergy. The human provided the perception and fine motor control. The machine provided the lightning-fast, infallible calculation. The results were nothing short of staggering. In rigorous testing, the Air Force pitted gunners using the old ring and bead sights against those using the new K-14. The data was unequivocal. In nearly every combat scenario, the K-14 doubled the hit probability. An average gunner, equipped with a gyro sight, could now achieve the same accuracy as a top-tier expert using the old method. It was a force multiplier of incredible power. For the Luftwaffe pilots attacking American bomber formations, the sky had suddenly become twice as deadly. The brief window of time they had to make their attack run had been slashed in half. Hesitation for even a fraction of a second was now a fatal mistake. As the war entered its final brutal phases, in 1944 and 1945, the sight became standard equipment. The combination of a gunner with a re-engineered instinct and a gun with a mechanical brain represented the zenith of defensive aerial warfare. It was the culmination of the entire journey, a journey that started with a catastrophic failure of instinct, was rectified by a revolution in training, validated in the trial by fire over Schweinfurt, and was now perfected by a leap in technology. The problem first identified by the slaughtered crews of the RAF had finally been solved, and in solving it, the Allies had not only created a superior weapon system, but had also written a powerful, enduring lesson about the dynamic partnership between a well-trained human and a well-designed machine, a lesson that would echo far beyond the end of the war. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged transformed, bearing the scars of a global conflict that had redrawn maps and redefined the limits of human endeavor. The story of the American aerial gunner is a powerful, focused epic within that larger saga. It's a story that begins with a deadly problem, is solved by a radical shift in thinking, and is perfected by technological genius. The final numbers tell a tale of staggering success. From that single, makeshift school in the Nevada desert grew a network of 7 specialized training centers. By the end of the war, they had graduated over 214,000 qualified gunners. These weren't just men given a weapon. They were specialists, components of a sophisticated defensive system that had been tested, and proven in the most demanding laboratory on Earth. The data, compiled from countless combat reports, confirmed the revolution's impact. Gunners who had undergone the full 6-week training program were officially credited with a kill rate at least twice as high as those who had been rushed into combat without it. Twice as high is a cold, clinical statistic. But what does it truly represent? It represents thousands of German fighters falling from the sky. It represents tens of thousands of bomber crewmen, pilots, navigators, bombardiers who returned home to their families because the young man in the waist, tail, or turret did the impossible. He trusted math over his own terrified senses. He laid an invisible trap in the sky, and the enemy flew right into it. He saved his crew, flight after flight. That is the true legacy written in the skies over Europe. The principles pioneered in that desert classroom did not fade away with the end of World War II. They became deeply embedded in military doctrine. The concept of position firing, of calculating the complex relationship between a moving firing platform, a moving target, and the ballistic properties of a projectile remains a cornerstone of modern warfare. It lives on in the sophisticated computer systems of today's fighter jets, where a pilot's helmet-mounted display can instantly calculate a firing solution for a target that is far off axis. It lives on in the automated phalanx CIWS systems on naval ships, which create a wall of lead to intercept incoming sea-skimming missiles. It lives on in the digital DNA of every fire-and-forget missile. The technology has become infinitely more complex, but the fundamental physics, the secret of the Texas Sergeant, remains the same. But perhaps the most profound legacy of this story isn't about military hardware or strategic doctrine. It's a deeply human lesson, one that extends far beyond the battlefield. It's a testament to our species' remarkable capacity for adaptation. It's a story that proves we can, when faced with a problem that seems insurmountable, consciously choose to override our most basic, hardwired instincts. We can learn to abandon what feels right in favor of what the data and logic tell us is actually right. Think about it. In every field of human endeavor, from medicine to finance to engineering, progress is often defined by our willingness to embrace counterintuitive ideas. A surgeon learns to make tiny incisions that seem impossibly small, trusting the technology of laparoscopy over the old instinct to open the body up. An investor learns to buy stocks when every fearful impulse screams to sell, trusting in the long-term logic of the market. An engineer designs a bridge that defies gravity, trusting in the cold, hard math of stress and load calculations. Each of these is a form of position firing. Each requires a leap of faith away from common sense and toward a less obvious, but more powerful, truth. The story of the World War II gunner is a dramatic reminder that our instincts, while essential for our survival for millions of years, are not always equipped to handle the complex challenges of the modern world. Sometimes, the path to success, and even survival, requires us to aim where our target isn't. It requires us to have the humility to admit that our gut feeling might be wrong, and the courage to trust in a system, a process, or a principle that feels alien and unnatural at first. It's about having the discipline to train our minds to see the invisible forces at play, whether it's the inherited velocity of a bullet or the unseen market forces shaping an economy. So now, we turn the final question to you. The principle of position firing saved thousands of lives by forcing brave soldiers to do what felt completely wrong. In your own life, in your career, or in your personal growth, has there ever been a time when you had to apply a kind of aim behind the target principle to succeed? A moment where you had to ignore your gut instinct and trust a logical but counterintuitive path to achieve a breakthrough? We invite you to share your story in the comments below. We read every single one, because these are the stories that truly reveal how timeless lessons from history continue to shape our world today. And if you believe, as we do, that sometimes the most brilliant ideas are the ones that challenge our common sense the most, then be sure to subscribe and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden genius in the pages of history.